G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and a fantastic start to your week. Now Australians have the day off today following Australia Day yesterday, so I hope that you're also enjoying your day off. Now legends, as always, we have a lot to go over. We will be looking at the maps and some geolocated footage. Now I do have a number of maps for you today, but as you may know, Mr. Syriac Maps is away on some much needed and deserved rest, so we will rely on other maps for the time being. We'll be talking about strikes. We'll look over a news article talking about end of war scenarios, and we'll present their end of war scenario, and then I'll present what I see as being the realistic scenario at the moment as well, and taking into account all of those different aspects. We need to talk about manpower issues. Ukrainian forces from the Air Force being transferred into the infantry, apparently still happening even after it was told that no, this is going to stop, as well as we know about the brigade trained in France that then had a horrible outcome with 1,700 guys deserting or going AWOL and the remaining having very heavy losses, and there's been another unit with a very similar fate. But where we need to start is Velyka Novosilka. So if we have a look on the maps, of course, we'll have Ukraine in the centre of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. And we'll come down into the south and we'll see Velyka Novosilka here, of course, coming under Russian occupation. Now, some will say, oh, there's a few blocks out here which are still under Ukrainian control. Look, for the sake of Velyka Novosilka, I am prepared to say that this is fully under Russian control and occupation at this point in time. But as we feared, there is some horrible footage coming out of Velyka Novosilka. A lot of soldiers did not get out of here, which we did fear for a number of weeks. And from this footage, it appears to have turned into a bit of a massacre. And we speak about manpower issues, and I put that Ukraine's number one problem at the moment, well, there's equal number one problems. Incompetence of command causing issues like this, and manpower shortages. And situations like we see in Velyka Novosilka with these guys left here, these exacerbate large desertions and AWOL, so therefore makes the manpower situation even worse. And I am disgusted that from the most popular bloggers online, we hear absolute silence about the situation here. Those who have a large enough voice, a large enough reach, who would actually be able to bring sunlight to the issues of what happened here. Command issues, incompetence, and all of this is killing the very men which these bloggers so vocally say that they support. Yet they're not willing to bring sunlight to the issues that could save these guys' lives and have better outcomes on the front line. But instead, in the interest of their wallets and their narrative, they choose to ignore the maps and instead shit-can the US administration, call Elon Musk a Nazi, even after defending and denying actual Nazi symbology and some rhetoric for now years. Completely ignoring and not willing to bring sunlight to an issue that they may have some power to actually change and influence then the outcomes for some of these guys on the front line. There is a direct correlation between Ukrainian territorial losses and how much they will push Russia's imminent economic collapse. And we see this in peaks and troughs throughout the war. We see it the other way as well when Ukraine was having success back in 2023. What I will say is feel-good narratives, they don't save lives, they don't impact policy, nor do they then win wars. People may call me a doomer, and that is fine. You can call me what you would like. But I've always been on the side of the boys on the front line to have better outcomes or reduced suffering in accordance with the laws of armed conflict that we have. And I've lost a lot of friends during this war, both from home and in Ukraine, and most likely banned from visiting some countries around the world too. But I myself could lay my head down and know I have pushed the truth as I see it. I'm not here to dick ride any politician. And my doomer-like analysis, that some will call it, may seem to focus on worst-case scenarios. And I believe that this is a reflection of my military infantry training in MLCOA, which is the most likely course of action, and MDCOA, the most dangerous course of action. You use these so you can preemptively strategize to mitigate adverse results. And I was in charge of the navigation for tens, if not hundreds of movements around Afghanistan. And the planning for if things went right was this long. The planning for if things started going wrong was much, much longer because, of course, the consequences there are much, much higher. So maybe that influences, and I can have a bit of catastrophic thinking in my life. But I think so many disgust me are ignoring this to push a narrative, even though they say, oh, we support this and we've trapped the Russians and this and that, and are having a completely adverse effect because they're thinking about their narrative they want to push, maintaining their followers and maintaining those sweet, sweet dollars going into their pocket. So let's look at Velyka Novosilka and Deep State, who has got in trouble before for telling, quote, too much of the truth, has said this: visual fixation of the enemy in central part of Velyka Novosilka. Of course, showing the multiple geolocations of Russian flags going up all around Velyka Novosilka. And at this point in time, one of the things impacting the Russian economy is making new flags too. This is probably the first time in our memory that someone is officially holding something, and then the Russians are walking around the village with their Prussian steppe and flags and launching fireworks. And I will say it's not the first time in my memory that officially bloggers, officials, whoever is holding something. Bakhmut holds, Velyka Novosilka holds, Avdiivka holds, XYZ. Meanwhile, we see geolocations telling a very different story. In general, sometimes there is an opportunity to report the loss of large settlements to official spokespeople so that they can report it to society they see fit for a good cause. Instead, this is perceived as a demonstrated opportunity to hang pasta on their ears while the enemy is being recorded by monitoring groups. So sticking your fingers in your ears, going la 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 la, and ignoring the truth on the front line. And these large bloggers in the hundreds of thousands, in the millions, who get 10, 20, 30 times the views I do, I don't care about the views, I care about the truth, completely ignoring this. And this line here from Deep State sums it up well. Lies will destroy us all. First, the neighbouring units, because they may believe an area is being held and that they do have security on their flanks or in front of them, which we've seen many incidences of this, and then society. Because, of course, then people turn around and go, hang on, I thought that there wasn't any critical situation happening. I didn't think that people had to be conscripted or recruit because everything is okay. And these people can affect change for who they say they so vehemently support. So let's have a look at the situation in here. And there's this article written at time of filming 14 hours ago, at time of you seeing this about 21 hours ago, by the Kyiv Independent, titled Potential Encirclement in Velyka Novosilka Prompts Questions About Last-Ditch Withdrawal Strategy. And this does have some very good points in this article too. Thrusting forward with their vast manpower advantage, Russian troops are gradually penetrating Ukrainian defences on the western edge of Donetsk Oblast and are close to capturing Velyka Novosilka. Now, even when this was written, it was seen that this was an occupied area, but we don't know how long the editing process had taken. But at this point in time, and when this was uploaded, Velyka Novosilka had fallen. It's now facing a similar fate to other Donbass strongholds, where Ukraine's delayed withdrawals resulted in avoidable casualties, just like many other areas where they have been withdrawn or attempted to withdraw way too late. And some of the footage coming out shows us of this fear too. Russian troops appear to have cut into the centre of Velyka Novosilka, likely dividing the town into two and trapping Ukrainian troops in the south. It is unclear how many Ukrainian troops were trapped inside the southern pocket in Velyka Novosilka, but it could be around 3 battalions. Given the dire manpower situation, in Ukraine, these battalions were likely depleted, with only a few hundred troops remaining in total. What I will say is that doesn't make it better that instead of thousands, there's only hundreds. The question is if it's closer to 1,000 or closer to a few hundred. And considering how bad the manpower situation is, it's probably going to be closer to several hundred. Adding that it's purely a rough estimate. And I can't give an estimate, I do not know. But I'd say they probably know better than I have how many soldiers actually are remaining in here. Battalion size is around 600, so 3 times, you're talking 1,800, but with the massive depletion in manpower, I do not know. But letting this happen again and again, well, I can tell you that that is not helping acute manpower issues. Ukrainian military spokesperson who have become familiar with, Viktor Troybov, said on January 23 that the risk of encirclement persists for Ukrainian troops in the Velyka Novosilka area. He claimed Ukraine's military had the situation under control. But the day before, Mr. Troybov said that there was no risk of encirclement and there was ability to withdraw. Soldiers are not dumb. In fact, soldiers on the front line have a far better idea of the situation than 99% of analysts. The misinformation, the command incompetence is playing a major role in morale across the front line everywhere, and recruitment. Way more of a role than maybe some limited Western arms. I'm not saying it doesn't have an effect. I'm saying it's not to the same effect. As Ukraine tries to hold onto Donetsk Oblast strongholds, no matter how close Russian troops are to capturing them, more Ukrainian soldiers and Western experts are raising concern about the cost of such decisions. But if you bring this up, next thing, you're apparently hanging out with Putin on his yacht. Similarly to the situation unfolding in Velyka Novosilka, exhausted Ukrainian troops defending the town of Avdiivka, located just outside Russian-occupied Donetsk, were left behind in and around the town. Multiple surviving soldiers told the Kyiv Independent. 2 soldiers from the 110th Separate Mechanized Brigade, which is currently defending Velyka Novosilka and facing a similar fate, have recounted how they had to leave behind dozens of their wounded comrades in order to increase their own chances of survival. This exact thing happened in Avdiivka, with horrible footage coming from that as well. If Russia captures Velyka Novosilka, it will be their first notable victory in 2025, which has occurred over the past 24 hours, with many soldiers left behind too. Russian troops have been on the offensive for more than a year, capturing long-time Ukrainian strongholds in Donetsk Oblast, including Avdiivka, Vuhledar, Seladov, and Kursk in 2024. But one thing we see in this is with each one of these, as time moves on, there is less and less resistance. Compare the battle for Bakhmut in 2023, I was going to say last year, compare that with the resistance that we've seen in Seladov, in Velyka Novosilka, in other areas. And this can give you an idea about shortages, morale, manpower, all of this. Elsewhere on the front line, Russian troops are gradually pushing Ukrainian forces out of the salient that they control in Russia's Kursk Oblast. Meanwhile, the city of Kupiansk in Kharkiv Oblast is facing another Russian offensive. Russia's imminent seizure of Velyka Novosilka comes about a year and a half after Ukraine began a counteroffensive in the summer of 2023, where it tried to liberate villages along the Mokry-Yaly River. The furthest they advanced was the village of Urzani, about 10 kilometres south of Velyka Novosilka, and we have seen Russia relatively turn back these gains very quickly. I say relative because it's relative to the rest of the war. And this is, of course, attritional warfare. Now the picture is entirely different, with Russia reclaiming all the villages and threatening to advance further. Velyka Novosilka's fall could impact the situation in Zaporizhia and Donetsk Oblasts, as only open fields lie beyond the village, according to this gentleman, a retired Ukrainian colonel and military analyst. And this is what we spoke about yesterday, as from the north of here, there is a lot of open fields. This ground being lost, this is not just small villages and some tree lines. This is fortified positions, some of which have stood for years, some of which in other areas for more than a decade. He stressed that it took a long time for Russia to finally come close to capturing Velyka Novosilka, and that holding onto the village makes sense because it is exhausting Moscow's resources that could be used elsewhere. And this is what we hear again and again. But relatively, it didn't take a long time to come under control. It actually came under very, very quickly. And the images coming out of Velyka Novosilka don't suggest this. And the TOS landing here for days before we saw that movement in, which we predicted, says very different. He also says Russian troops are attacking only on one relatively narrow front line. This is the price of holding on. Now, I don't really understand what he's getting at here. Russia is attacking a dozen different fronts at once using Brusilov offensive tactics developed in the First World War and taking advantage of their greater numbers. You push on many separate areas as they have the numerical advantage, causing the other side, who has acute manpower shortages and just not the population to begin with, to be thinned out along the entire front line. Russia has captured Vremenka, a village just southwest of Velyka Novosilka, and then Novaya Koma, a village to its north, gradually cutting off supply routes for Ukrainian troops. He stressed that the sharp contrast in manpower leverage has allowed Moscow to gradually advance despite the cost, and that it is impossible to prevent it. So how do we think there's going to be a position of power? But Russian tactics remain unchanged, relying on the continuous deployment of small groups of 5 to 7 assault soldiers, until enough troops are gathered to properly advance on nearby Ukrainian positions. But this tactic is maybe remained unchanged in the previous months or year of capturing the flanks and then smaller groups go in, but it's very different to how we saw the Russian forces fight in the beginning. They accumulate 20, 30 or even 50 people for certain positions, and it can last for weeks. Then this group moves forward. Imagine being 2 people in a trench with 50 Russian soldiers storming towards you, yet will still continue this narrative that this is a good thing because of the drain on Russian manpower and resources, even if in this example here is 25 to 1. Ukrainian troops should withdraw earlier to prevent encirclements. Absolutely. This gentleman from Blackbird Group, I believe a Finnish group, he called the situation of Velyka Novosilka a completely self-inflicted situation caused by Ukrainian mismanagement. Either Ukraine's top military leadership is unable to comprehend the brutal reality on the ground, or it is way too slow at making these difficult decisions, like, for example, giving up a village. And what is happening here, I don't believe, is not able to comprehend this, but it's placing PR over tactical decisions. And what we are seeing is then the bloggers completely just push the same narratives. This situation could have been foreseen for months, and we have seen this happening for weeks, saying this is going to be really, really bad. Stressing that the Russian advance had slowed down for the past 2 months, possibly due to winter weather conditions or potential resource exhaustion. Probably a little bit of multiple things. Winter weather, absolutely, but also coming into more fortified positions and larger towns or cities. And of course, a reduction in resources and men as well can play a role, but I don't believe as big of a role as the other factors. The situation has already been such for a week or so, ever since the Russians got into Vremenka. At that point, it was a done deal. And stressing here, this should have been seen. So let's have a look at the comments here, because I think this sums up a couple of different trains of thinking. So this top comment here, after all, operational security is one of the strong suits for the Ukrainian armed forces. But the next comment down says, yeah, they made a movie trailer for the counteroffensive. OPSEC is definitely their strong suit. But let's get into what is actually happening here. What if the Ukrainian General Staff has deliberately lured the Russians to overexpose themselves in the area? What if strategic reserves, of which I do not know if they do or don't exist, can or can't be deployed, are being brought in right now to give the Russians a bloody nose in a target-rich environment of their own making? And this is the train of thought that we see again and again and again, is no, it's a good thing that we're fighting on 3 sides. It's a good thing we're encircled and fighting on 4 sides because of the Russians pouring in resources and pouring in men. And I'm not saying they're not pouring that in, but at the same time, again and again, people can mix this. The mental gymnastics is gold fucking medal worthy of saying that this is then a good thing. And I'm not trying to get into this gentleman here, because I believe so many who are seen as competent are pushing this same narrative. And then Samuel here, he has, I think, a fantastic comment which aligns exactly with what I'm thinking. The issue with that theory is that Ukraine is completely tied up. The encirclement and now capture of Velyka Novosilka is very similar to that of Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Seladov, Ugledar, and even Soledar. Ukraine's issue is that they don't withdraw at all, and their men get caught in an almost inescapable cauldron. The retreat from Avdiivka after the Russian capture there saw 50% casualties for fleeing Ukrainian troops, which is atrocious and devastating for Ukraine. At Velyka Novosilka, there aren't numbers for Ukrainians in the city, but geolocated footage shows the city was cut in half and the southern sector was completely surrounded. The northern sector could flee, but over a river and open fields that for weeks now have been getting ruthlessly peppered by Russian drones and artillery. We've been showing you this footage. There's been a lot of Russian drone footage of Ukrainian vehicles getting destroyed, going to and from the city up to 5 kilometers away. And this is why for the past few weeks, I've been showing you this footage. Ukraine's most elite and heavily armed troops are tied up needlessly in Kursk, while the conscripts are sacrificed like this all along the eastern front. There are no large settlements to conceal troop numbers outside of Velyka until Tumour, which is 10 miles north, so Ukraine is unlikely to stage a counterattack even if they had the means stashed away. The Ukrainian command needs to be held accountable for this and their disregard for their men, essentially when they have such an acute manpower shortages. Ukrainian soldiers deserve better, but their commanders keep making the same avoidable mistakes over and over. It's frustrating. They need to be sacked and replaced by company experienced leaders from the front. They'll be unlikely to stop the Russians, but it'll be a change that'll save Ukrainian lives and slow the Russians if it's anything. And this is a realistic view, and I believe that this is an idealistic view, potentially built off those bloggers, those media who are just completely ignoring this. So let's have a look at some strikes before we'll have a look at the maps. And what we have seen is a lot of Ukrainian drones crossing into Russia and targeting oil depots, and Ryazan oil refinery got hit. Again, how much effect does this have on the Russian economy, on then depletion of air defense? We don't really know, but again, we will see in time. Then we have also seen, of course, an underwater cable that is connecting Sweden and Latvia has been damaged, of course, under the Baltic Sea. It's not the first time in recent memory we've seen something like this, with Ursula von der Leyen saying there's full solidarity with these EU countries. The resilience and security of our critical infrastructure is a top priority. We're committed to improving detection, prevention, and repair with global partners. But all the top comments here, they talk about Nord Stream, and they talk about the accident which happened back in, well, it was declared an accident back in January 19th as well, and people pointing that this could be some level of false flag. I don't think it is. Do I think it's a hybrid warfare attack or an accident? Well, those are the two options, and I don't really know. But von der Leyen made a very similar statement when the Nord Stream was attacked, and then deafening silence following this. So what will we see against those ships that are either having accidents or conducting hybrid warfare? I don't know. I guess we may see. So let's have a look at the maps and have a look at some other areas. Now, firstly, I want to come into Kursk and Rivka. Now, firstly, this should be in red check because it is a new update today. I don't know what the fuck is happening here either. Remember, Suryak Map told us yesterday that the Russians were right out to Andrivka. What we can confirm is there's definitely Russians on the outskirts of Andrivka, but this is looking like they are cut off by some 4 kilometers. In my opinion, my belief, this is probably more something like this. But we will wait and see. I don't really know what this is really trying to show. Up in Pokrovsk, we can see Russian advancement to the south of these areas, to the north of Novo and Rivka as well, creating just small pockets and moving up. That is how we know the Russians move. Then we come up into Toretsk and we can see just small advancements into here. Of course, many maps are disagreeing with this a hell of a lot. And then we come just north of here and we have Chasiv Yar. Now, this is where we have this map from DivGen here. And what this is showing is basically these tree lines, this forest area in here is closing up. And the best way to do this, it's not the easiest, but see this intersection, this is right here. So through just to the north, see this is this water right in here. So basically right where my cursor is at the moment, that this area is under Russian control. But what we talk about is this sort of paint by numbers of Russia using TOS systems before they move into an area. And this has been reflected across many different areas, including what you'll be most familiar with of Velyka Novosilka. And in these outskirts just here of Chasiv Yar, so right in where my cursor is at the moment, we see that the Russians are employing TOS thermobaric weapon systems in here that are devastating against fortified positions. We have one more map update for you based on geolocated footage. Now, it's going to take me just a second to find this. I'm looking for this Kovalivka in this direction. So we have this footage here of a Russian flag being flown by Russian troops here, and then at the end, I thought we saw, yeah, we do. We see Russian forces then speaking here in, of course, snow camouflage. Where this is geolocated is right in here. So where we're looking is, see where these two tree lines run up? It's just to the west in about here. I measured, when I did the specific geolocation, about 2.92 kilometres from where the front line is sitting. So we do know there is definitely some movement from geolocation out something at minimum like this. But we'll wait and see what the other maps move on this. After the fall of Velyka Novosilka, there will be some reluctance to show larger gains in other areas too. So let's look at manpower issues. And what I've said is this is exacerbated by many factors. Yes, it may be by the NATO dragging their feet on some weapon systems. It may be some policy in the West, potentially. Yes, I'm not saying that doesn't have an effect. What do I believe it is most caused by? Failures on the front line, command incompetence, and other manpower shortages, then not wanting to step into a unit with manpower shortages. We saw this happen, of course, with the French unit, and that this is being reported from a unit that was trained in Germany. 153rd Mechanised Brigade, the combat readiness problems are the same as the 155th. A significant number of appeals from servicemen of the 153rd Brigade, not from those who went AWOL, but from those who conscientiously continue to perform combat missions. This NWVH is just a translation error for AWOL. Some of the servicemen are training in Germany. During training abroad, only a few deserted. The entire personnel returned to Ukraine and went to the front. But as a result of organisational, managerial miscalculations, problems, and massive AWOL begun. The brigade, which was given thousands of mobilised people, an entire Bradley battalion, and other valuable combat equipment, did not receive the necessary number of experienced, competent commanders, and did not receive drones, did not receive support, did not receive serviceable vehicles for logistics, and instead of a powerful reserve, it became a source of problems, primarily for the heroic people who fight in its ranks despite everything. Soldiers complain about: number one, incompetent task planning and command, lack of experienced commanders. Remember, these guys who were trained by NATO forces. 2, trained soldiers were taken away several times during the formation process to replenish other military units. So your training, your experience that should proliferate through the ranks is then just culled. 3, a lack of situational awareness and drone support of infantry actions, and a lack of anti-drone systems. 4, a lack of spare parts and repair of the M2 Bradley IFV, which one of the battalions is armed with. But 2 to 3 infantry fighting vehicles are fully operational in the companies, and the others are being repaired. 5, insufficient time for training and coordination. In fact, except for Germany, there was no full-fledged training cycle in Ukraine, and the training in Germany was fragmented and not systematic. The brigade needed much more intensive and systematic training of infantry, artillery, drone operators, and combat vehicles. I really want to help these motivated and resilient soldiers who, despite everything, carry out tasks and fight battles, hold the defence. But if the infantry does not receive at least a short quality of training, if a small group of leaders are not nominated and trained, no miracles will happen. The brigade will be exhausted. Like all these 140s, 150s, which are not allocated to either ready-made command personnel or time for their training. So coming down to, number 1, command and control issues. And we see what has happened in many sectors of the front line being very similar. Kiev independent again, with transfer of Air Force personnel to infantry continues despite scandal, which we know even President Zelensky had to stand in on this. Ukrainian military's command to plan to throw highly skilled Air Force personnel into infantry was said to be halted when the practice gained nationwide attention. Soldiers who spoke to Kiev Independent on conditions of anonymity say, however, nothing has changed and the transfers are set to continue. Uninterrupted by public attention that condemned a wasteful use of specialist troops, the Air Force leadership, obeying higher military command's orders, is set to continue sending more of its men to infantry in waves, who are not trained to be in those positions. One Air Force officer confirmed that the transfer would continue due to poor mobilisation results, but he could not officially reveal the figure due to the topic's sensitivity. Such transfers can have detrimental effects. The transfer of about 5,000 to 6,000 servicemen from the Air Force to the ground forces begun this January. Now, further in this article it says, while the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces claim on January 14 that there were no plans to increase the acute shortage of specialists of the Air Force Engineering and Aviation Service who maintain aircraft infantry units, it acknowledged that many areas lack infantry. It added that it is a necessary step to strengthen defence by reinforcing combat brigades with soldiers from other branches of the armed forces. This doesn't seem to align with the very relatively small losses that we hear being reported. Faced with heavy losses among battle-torn units, the Ukrainian military has been transferring specialised troops such as artillerymen, drone pilots, medics and sappers, engineers, to replenish the infantry, often causing a shortage into the now forcibly depleted units. And this is how this then snowballs, is yes, you need infantry first, but if you don't have artillery, you don't have drone pilots, you don't have X, Y, Z after that, things are going to get worse and worse. And one of the biggest ones is people who operate air defence. Sursky has said in an interview, mobilisation capabilities unfortunately do not cover this need. And what we do know, mobilisation, recruitment, conscription, all of this is not covering the losses at the front line. The reality of soldiers who transferred from one profession to another without any preparation is gruesome, as painted by their surviving comrades. The guys who were transferred to the infantry, 40% were killed and 40% were wounded in the first days if directly sent to the front, while some, a very small percentage, are still fighting. Ukrainian and Western military experts were split in their opinions, with some arguing how the deep-rooted resource management issues are leading to the loss of experienced personnel, while others reiterate that some skills are less needed due to modernisation of equipment. What we know is there's a manpower shortage of infantry. And in my opinion, what is more needed? Hundreds of men at the front in the infantry or hundreds of men working on planes? The infantry is the most desperate, but without these other supporting elements, it's going to get more desperate for the infantry, especially if these guys are not adequately trained. The issue, he said, is that it takes necessary skills to replace the Air Force team that maintains aircraft, tracks aerial targets and shoot down drones. And there's also, at least I believe, a very large concern about some of these staff with specialist training and knowledge being captured POW and some of that sensitive information being handed across to the Russians about storage of aircraft and where air defence systems are as well. So what we know is not only is conscription, mobilisation, recruitment not meeting replacement, that because of these other issues, because of command issues and because of a lot of others, a lot of people are walking then off the front line. And at this point in time, I really can't blame them. If you have not received the training that you should have, you do not have any faith in your command and you're being sent to the hottest area of the front line, who the fuck are we to sit back in Australia or Switzerland or whatever and blame these guys? So let's look over some end of war scenarios. Now, this was published here with the title, How Could the Russia-Ukraine War End? With 4 possible scenarios. As Ukraine's fate hangs in the balance, can President Trump deliver peace or will the country face a total defeat? So that was heading, subheading. Trump's victory, once feared by Ukrainians, now the country needs a new US president. You would be surprised how many people in Ukraine are very relieved that Trump won and is wanting to bring an end to this war. In matters of national security, Ukraine awaits the decision of President Trump as a wounded gladiator awaits the turn of an emperor's thumb. Though not broken yet, the hard-fighting nation is certainly on its knees. On the battlefield, the picture has never been so gloomy. Russian troops seized 6 times more Ukrainian territory in 2024 than they did in 2023. More than half the territory Ukraine captured in their surprise autumn Kursk incursion has been ceded. What we need to take into consideration in Kursk is what we looked at in those articles before, that some of the best trained and heavily armed are in Kursk, while conscripts are thrown into the bloody fire down in the south and the east. Ukrainian industry has received new and withering blows too. Outside Pokrovsk, the mighty Mitinvest mine, the only facility in the country to produce the coking coal vital for Ukraine's steel-making industry, is the scene of heavy fighting. It was closed down and evacuated by Ukrainian miners 10 days ago, who first blew up one of the main shafts to prevent it being used by Russian troops to advance underground. We showed you this. I'll show you again on the map where this is. We have, of course, the Donbass front, the Donetsk front, Udashne, and this mine out here. Absolutely critical. Remember, this is Ukraine's second biggest industry. If and when this comes under control, and if the war ends and that is remaining in Russian territory, the post-war attrition is going to be very significant from losing that, as well as all the other areas and men too. Breaking Vlad. Trump's election victory was once feared by Ukrainians who doubted that an American president who professed good rapport with Vladimir Putin could ever bring them joy. Yet 3 years of spasmodic military support and an inarticulate strategy from President Biden, which brought the nation a sense of sliding survival and slow defeat, has allowed desperate hope to flourish amongst Ukrainians that the new US president, a man so vocal in his intent to ending the war, might possibly finish the conflict in a favourable way. Though Trump has been critical of Putin and President Zelensky. Now, the reason I've highlighted this is, one, he's been critical of both, but this article refuses to say President Trump or President Putin. Anyway, if we don't make a deal soon, I have no other choice but to put high levels of taxes, tariffs and sanctions on anything being sold by Russia to the United States. It's what Trump has posted on Truth Social. But I don't think that this is the major blow that many think that it is. In 2024, there was $2.8 billion worth of goods sold from Russia to the US. 23, $4.5 billion. 22, $14.4 billion. This is a lot of money. It's a hell of a lot of money. But is this about to absolutely break things? I don't believe that it is. That Russia's already finding other markets for this. You can see that it's decreased massively from the beginning of $14.5 billion down to $2.75 billion this last year. And this year will be even less, if not zero. But is that going to affect everything? I don't think in the way that Trump thinks it may. Ignoring unlikely scenarios involving Putin's sudden death or a magical Ukrainian counteroffensive, there are 4 realistic outcomes to the war. Ultimately, Putin believes that Russia can outlast Western commitment and defeat Ukraine. And it's an important takeaway is that Putin does believe that. Therefore, will take that belief into his calculus as well. And I don't think that he's wrong to think that. Scenario 1 is defeat. The first scenario is the worst. Should Russia choose to proceed with the war and shun negotiations, then if severed from US support, Ukraine may eventually be broken and militarily defeated. Cognizant of his own wish to end the war fast and recalling his criticism of President Biden's clumsy withdrawal from Afghanistan, Trump will be wary of allowing this catastrophic outcome to unfold. If Ukraine is crushed, the implications for global security will be far worse than the fallout of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. I think he's correct in global implications for global security, but not domestic anger either, because in Afghanistan, of course, it was something I think it was $9 trillion and a lot of US casualties there too. Millions more Ukrainian refugees would pour out of the country. Thousands of those who remained would be incarcerated in Russian penal colonies, and NATO, once proud of its enlargement into Finland and Sweden, would end up instead with Russia's expansion westwards and Kremlin tanks abutting Poland. What I'll say in this is Trump will not deploy US troops into Ukraine. And without the US, NATO will not deploy troops into Ukraine. If Putin calculates that his economy will sustain, even with further tariffs and taxes and sanctions, he may continue. Defeat on the battlefield is unlikely. This scenario I see is not completely what is going to happen. But the post-war attrition will be absolutely critical, especially if Ukraine is not in NATO or the EU. And he touches on this, that millions will leave Ukraine. Ukraine will not have those guarantees. They will not have those mines. And the post-war attrition doesn't need to be won on the battlefield for defeat. I don't think that Putin will object to Ukraine joining the European Union. Ukraine joining the European Union could actually help Putin in the way that it will cause way more division and a huge economic commitment. So there'll be division from Slovakia and Hungary and definitely other states as well who may be less vocal about this. And if then is accepted, there's going to have to be trillions of dollars poured in as well. And of course, still mass emigration as well. Scenario 2, bad peace. Almost as bad as the first possible outcome is the second, in which, absent a negotiated deal or US support, Ukraine folds and is forced to sue from a position of weakness for a bad peace deal that sees the country petitioned and a quisling government established in Kyiv. A victory for Russia and a clear defeat for Ukraine and its Western allies. No Nobel Peace Prize for Trump here. That said, the post-war attrition in this scenario would lead to scenario number 1. If Ukraine folds, they don't have security guarantees, they don't have economic rebuild, and there we have emigration, we've got all this, it would then lead to number 1. So I see these as being very similar. Now, post-war attrition, of course, exists for Russia, but I believe it will be significantly less because you're not going to have the amount of immigration leaving Russia or the amount of destruction in Russia either. And a lot of this, as far as areas destroyed and loss of population, if they walk away with what they occupy in Ukraine at the moment, will be buffered by then gaining that. Scenario 3, ceasefire. The third involves a ceasefire. It's part of a transitionary phase leading to a final settlement, a peace deal, and a real conclusion to the war. Then it could lead to a regional stability and the survival of Ukraine, ring-fenced by security and economic guarantees. Without a final settlement, Trump's inner circle is clearly aware that a ceasefire in itself is not enough. Standing alone, a halt in fighting would merely freeze the war along existing front lines. Ukraine and its Western allies are already conscious of 2 previous crippled ceasefire deals, of course Minsk 1, Minsk 2. Zelensky and Putin have both said that a ceasefire is not on the table. They want a final end to it. Of course, they have very different views of where that final end is, but not a ceasefire. Because all they're saying is, well, the war will just start again. In an encouraging sign, Mark Rubio, the new US Secretary of State, acknowledged the necessity of going further than simply halting the fighting, saying we want to do everything we can to help it end. We're going to engage in making it end in a way that is sustainable, meaning we don't just want the conflict to end and then restart in 2, 3 or 4 years down the road. So I think realistically, ceasefire off the table as well. Number 4 is negotiated settlement, most likely. The fourth possible outcome, and the crucible of Ukrainian hope, would involve the US empowering Ukraine's hand so that it could participate in peace talks from a position of strength. No one is willing to say what needs to be done, though, to put Ukraine in a position of strength. I think Zaluzny did in 2023, saying we had 500,000 men, and it's shown again and again that he was correct in that assumption. But to get those men is going to take 12, 18 months, if possible at all, even with French and German trained units going AWOL en masse, resulting in a deal ensuring Ukraine has a sovereign and economically viable future. Given it is unlikely that Russian territorial gains at this stage of the conflict will be rolled back, empowering Ukraine's hand translates as Trump heaping sanctions on Russia and continuing to support Ukraine with weapons and money if Russia chooses either to shun peace negotiations or participate in bad faith. But again, how much more effect can further sanctions have, and how much more support of weapons and money can be given if there's not men to have their finger on the trigger? Ukraine will need to swallow a fistful of bitter pills if this settlement scenario is to become reality. Conquered territory will be ceded. The country will likely never in this lifetime see its borders of 1991 returned. It may or may not see the return of some of the territory lost to Russia since 2022. Many Ukrainians seem to accept some sort of territorial concession as a necessity to ending the conflict. It's increased 32% if assured of American security and economic guarantees, and we have seen that growing and growing as the suffering of the war has grown and grown as well. More than money, men and bullets. Given the vagaries of Europe's ability to finance and arm Kyiv among Ukraine's allies, Trump's influence will be overarching in affecting which of these 4 scenarios most likely becomes reality. However, neither money nor munitions nor sanctions will be enough to settle the conflict in Ukraine's favour unless Ukraine can also redress its own flawed military and political decisions. Despite repeated warnings by his generals, Zelensky's failure to grip the draft law and reduce the age of conscription has led to his forces being chronically undermanned across the Eastern Front. So why do we assume then a negotiated settlement from a position of strength? Why do we assume, given 3 years and this has not been gripped up from the top to the bottom, why do we then presume that Putin's calculus isn't that there's going to be manpower shortages before my economy fully falls out the arse? Both are on their way down, but I think one is coming down much faster. Meanwhile, Ukraine's military staff continues to bungle the army's training and deployment system. The most recent scandal around the military incompetence concerns the mass desertion of Ukrainian soldiers from the newly formed 155th Anne of Kiev Mechanised Brigade, of course trained in France, and the 153rd then trained in Germany. Of course, it was sent to France, dozens deserted in France, and then 1,700 then were AWOL deserted after this, and the troops who did stay suffered, of course, heavy casualties because you've got no further bloody support. As Trump may know, the outcome of war and peace is never decided solely by arithmetic of money, men and bullets. Nevertheless, in Ukraine's bleakest winter of war, two certainties remain. First, without America's support, Ukraine has no chance of ever reaching a position whereby it can negotiate a peace deal from a position of strength. I'm also not sure if Trump is willing to do what it would need to take to put Ukraine in that position, if that's actually possible without the deployment of troops en masse. Second, the lasting definition of victory or defeat at war's end will not lie with territorial concession and the loss of Donbass soil, but instead of whose sphere of alliance, the West or the Kremlin's, Ukraine shall find itself after the last bullet is fired. And this is somewhat true. I think that this is true. That if Ukraine can maintain any of its land and can come in the sphere of then Western alliances, that is a victory. But we have seen repeated by Kyiv, and they're being very vocal, that if 1 inch is occupied, that will be a loss of the war. But I'd like to give outcome 5 and how I see this. Negotiations, but based on the current frontline situation and what others will say the reality of the situation is. It is objectively true, Ukraine has acute manpower shortages, and these are getting worse, especially with things like huge losses in Velyka Novosilka from KIA, WIA, and AWOL, and the loss of faith in command. So it already has manpower issues, nothing is being done to fix that. I think Trump's first thing will be you need to mobilise 18 to 25, you need to be prepared to do that. Putin knows this and calculates that eventually he will take more ground. It will still be costly to his society, both in men and money, but he calculates that things are going to get easier as these shortages actually get worse, regardless of how many oil refineries are hit and regardless of how many weapons the West send in. If the problem is men, that will buffer it, but it's not going to solve it. I think Putin also calculates that his economy will outlast Ukraine's military. And currently it does seem this way. Even if we believe these numbers that are getting thrown around, so you see like the most NAFO-y style accounts and reports talking about end of 25 to mid 26 or 27 is when the Russian economy will collapse. We heard that, of course, in 22, about 23, 24. But let's take into account that it's 2026. There's going to be a collapse there. I would argue that Ukraine's military does not have another year that will be worse than this year left. And I think that's going into Putin's calculus for this war also. Trump, who is a realist, will make a deal as he views the current situation. That being right here and now that Russia is in a position of strength. And the decisions needed to be made by Ukraine that weren't, and the lack of commitment to make these decisions, for example, the conscription of 18 to 25, this will not sit well with Trump, especially when the US would have conscripted in that in a war of existential crisis. I think that will be a big turnoff for Trump. The negotiations will start at Putin taking at least the land occupied and Ukraine not being in NATO. I think that's where the negotiations will start, at least for Putin's side, based on what is happening at the front line and positions of power if they were to start now or in the next, or just in the foreseeable future. Although it will be allowed that individual NATO countries will be able to have alliances with Ukraine, but there'll be limits on weapon systems and range. And many people say, well, how does Russia have any say on what alliances Ukraine is part of? In a perfect world, they wouldn't. But the situation we're in, sadly, as a byproduct, They sort of do. It sucks, but they do, just the same as the US should have no say on Mexico's security. In a perfect world, they wouldn't. In sovereign, independent, kumbaya, they wouldn't. But do they? Yes. Putin, I don't believe, will object to Ukraine seeking and joining the EU. I think this division actually helps him and Xi Jinping. Of course, there will be big pushback from Turkey, who's not in the EU, Hungary and Slovakia, as well as potential other countries. I think that division helps a lot and will weaken the alliance, even if it's seen to seriously to join. And I think as well the rebuild cost that could be in the trillions. And then, of course, what we need to take into account is the post-war attrition, that if Ukraine does join EU, potentially Schengen, there'll just be mass immigration out, and potentially then Putin will end up having more territory from that, or more control at least, control over the government in Kyiv, if there's just mass immigration out as well. We've known that 33% of young people who are still in Ukraine want to leave for more opportunity, security, all of this, and if that's not guaranteed by NATO or the EU, it's going to be even worse. Now, I think on the other side, because there's going to have to be some give and take, it's negotiation, but Putin will be entering this in near future in a position of power unless there's some massive shift. But I think that Putin will agree to withdraw from Kharkiv, therefore for Kursk, but to withdraw from Kharkiv and hand over the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant to neutral controllers in return for some sanctions being lifted. So nuclear security for then some economic security for Russia. That's what I see as where the negotiations would be if they were held now or in the foreseeable future without some massive shift. I don't know. Legends, I hope that you are having a great day, you're looking after yourself, and I can't believe the people that put up with these just blatant ignoring of catastrophes occurring because it doesn't suit their narrative or their bottom line, I guess. Anyway, have a great day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.